The sun rose gently over the manicured lawns of the Maplewood Estates subdivision, its rays glinting off freshly waxed SUVs and perfectly aligned mailboxes. This neighborhood wasn't just a community, it was a kingdom ruled by a ruthless and overbearing homeowners association. At the head of this self-appointed monarchy sat none other than Karen Wallace, the HOA president, a woman whose obsession with control knew no boundaries. For months, Karen had been circling our property, like a hawk, watching every move with binoculars in hand. My wife, Julia, had always brushed off Karen's antics, preferring not to dignify her complaints with attention. But that peace shattered one Thursday morning when Julia opened the mailbox to find a thick envelope stamped with the HOA's insignia. Inside was a fine, not just any fine, but a staggering $3,500 penalty. The letter accused us of violating a dozen HOA rules, ranging from unauthorized landscaping adjustments to unsightly decorations on our porch. The so-called decorations were Julia's seasonal flowers. The landscaping adjustment? Trimming the hedge that was technically ours. Julia's first reaction was laughter, followed quickly by disbelief. She set the letter aside on the kitchen counter and went about her day. But Karen had been waiting for this moment, and ignoring her notice wasn't something she was willing to tolerate. Days passed. The fine remained unpaid. Each morning, Karen would slow her Lexus in front of our house, glaring at the windows as though expecting Julia to come running out with a check. Instead, Julia watered her flowers, waved politely, and went back inside. To Karen, this was defiance of the highest order. She documented everything, photos, timestamps, even notes about the non-compliance. She convinced herself that Julia was mocking her authority, and Karen was not a woman who could let such a thing go unpunished. On the 7th day after the notice, Karen decided to escalate. She dialed the local police department, claiming we were in violation of HOA rules, refusing to comply with community standards and creating a hostile environment by ignoring official notices. It was absurd, but Karen delivered her complaint with such drama and conviction that dispatch sent out a patrol car. That Saturday morning, Julia stood in the front yard trimming her roses when a black and white cruiser pulled up to the curb. The officer stepped out, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding. Karen appeared seconds later, rushing from her house as though she had been waiting by the window for this very moment. She pointed toward Julia, her voice shrill and triumphant. "That's her! That's the one who refuses to follow the rules!" Julia straightened, brushing soil from her gloves. The officer walked toward her, but just as he prepared to speak, his expression shifted. His eyes widened slightly, his hand froze mid-motion. He blinked, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Because Julia wasn't just any resident of Maplewood Estates. She wasn't just a wife, homeowner, or gardener. She was something else entirely. Someone who had spent years commanding courtrooms and holding power that far outweighed the petty politics of an HOA. And the officer knew it, the second he recognized her face. This wasn't Julia, the woman Karen thought she could bully into submission. This was Judge Julia Ramirez, one of the most respected figures in the county courthouse. The officer froze in place, stunned into silence. Karen, oblivious, kept ranting, her voice filling the quiet street. Julia, meanwhile, said nothing. She simply turned, lifted the envelope from the kitchen counter, and handed it to the officer without a word. The silence was deafening, broken only by the officer's sharp inhale as he realized the situation he had just walked into. And with that, the stage was set. What Karen thought would be her ultimate victory had just triggered a storm that would unravel not only the HOA's petty rules, but the very foundation of its corrupt power. The battle for control of Maplewood Estates had begun, and Julia was far from the type to back down. The officer stood rigid in front of our home, the HOA's notice trembling slightly in his hand. His eyes darted from the paper to Julia, then back again, as though his training had failed him in this unexpected moment. He had come here expecting a simple call, a suburban squabble, maybe a quick warning, then back to patrol. Instead, he found himself staring at the woman whose rulings had shaped court cases across the county. Judge Julia Ramirez wasn't just another homeowner. She was a name spoken with weight in legal circles, respected even by those who lost in her courtroom. She had a reputation for being fair but unyielding, precise in her decisions, and intolerant of manipulation. For the officer, recognition brought an avalanche of thoughts. He remembered the lectures given to police recruits. You never know who you're talking to at a traffic stop. Handle every situation with professionalism. But professionalism suddenly felt inadequate here. Behind him, Karen's voice kept rising, each word dripping with the smug confidence of someone who believed she had already won. She accused Julia of violating community law, as though the HOA's guidelines were etched into the Constitution itself. She gestured wildly at the officer, demanding citations, arrests, and immediate enforcement, but the officer didn't move. He knew something Karen didn't. An HOA notice was not a legal order. A fine issued by a neighborhood board was not the same as a ruling in court. And calling the police over unpaid dues or disputed flowers, it was a misuse of resources at best. Harassment at worst. The neighbors began to notice. Curtains twitched, front doors cracked open, people peeked out, drawn to the scene like moths to flame. Karen had wanted an audience, and now she had one. Except instead of watching Julia's humiliation, they were witnessing something very different. The unraveling of Karen's authority. Julia remained silent. She didn't need to argue. Her calm presence alone was a stark contrast to Karen's shrill outbursts. Every second of silence made Karen's voice sound more hysterical, more desperate. The officer finally cleared his throat, his voice cautious, but firm. He explained to Karen that this was a civil matter, not a criminal one. The police had no jurisdiction to enforce HOA fines. If the association wanted to pursue payment, they would have to file in civil court. Karen's face twisted in shock. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She had called the police expecting backup, a show of force, a moment where Julia would finally bow to her authority. Instead, the officer was dismantling her case with a few careful words. But Karen wasn't done. Her pride, her power, her entire identity as HOA president was on the line. She pressed harder, insisting that Julia's refusal to pay was a direct violation of the law, waving her binder of HOA regulations as if it were a sacred text. The officer didn't flinch. He handed the envelope back to Julia and stepped back, making it clear where his authority ended. Karen's voice faltered for the first time. She looked around at the neighbors, realizing they weren't nodding in agreement anymore. Some were smirking. Others were whispering. The spectacle she had staged was turning into an embarrassment. Julia still hadn't spoken a word. She simply nodded politely at the officer, turned back to her roses, and let the silence hang heavy in the air. It was a silence that said more than any argument could. You cannot touch me with your petty rules. But inside, Julia knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to retreat quietly. The HOA president had been embarrassed in public, her authority challenged in front of the very people she claimed to lead. And when someone like Karen felt cornered, she didn't surrender. She retaliated. The officer left, his car rolling slowly down the street. Neighbors drifted back inside. The street grew quiet again, but the tension remained, thicker than ever. Karen stood frozen for a moment, her binder clutched to her chest, her face red with a mixture of rage and humiliation. She stormed back into her house, slamming the door hard enough to echo down the block. And though the neighborhood appeared calm once more, Julia knew the storm was only beginning. Because Karen wasn't just fighting for a fine anymore, she was fighting for control. And she had just learned that Julia wasn't the kind of woman she could control. The real battle hadn't even started yet. The neighborhood settled into an uneasy quiet after the police left. But it was a silence that felt more like the pause before a thunderstorm than the peace of a calm afternoon. Julia returned to her roses, her hands steady, her face unreadable. Yet in the back of her mind she knew Karen would not let this humiliation stand. Karen had built her identity around power. She wasn't just the HOA president. She was the self-proclaimed guardian of community standards, a title she wielded with the fervor of a monarch defending her throne. To be dismissed by the police, exposed in front of her neighbors, and outshone by Julia's quiet composure. It was an insult Karen could neither forgive nor forget. That evening, the HOA board held a sudden emergency meeting. It wasn't on the calendar, it wasn't announced ahead of time, but those loyal to Karen received texts urging them to gather at her house. Inside her living room, the atmosphere was thick with anger. Karen recounted the scene with the police, twisting every detail, painting Julia as defiant, arrogant, and dangerous to the unity of Maplewood Estates. Her supporters nodded along, though uneasily. They had seen the spectacle themselves. They had heard the officer's words. But Karen's forceful personality had a way of bending reality until people began to question their own perceptions. She proposed escalating fines, legal threats, and even the possibility of lien actions against Julia's property. By the time the meeting ended, Karen had convinced herself she was on the righteous path. If Julia thought she could hide behind her title as a judge, Karen would find a way to tear that shield down. The next morning, a new notice appeared taped to our front door. Unlike the previous fine, this one was angrier, more personal. It listed exaggerated violations, hostile behavior toward board members, failure to maintain community harmony, refusal to comply with lawful directives. The fine wasn't just repeated, it had doubled. Now the HOA claimed Julia owed $7,000. Julia removed the notice without a word. She placed it in a folder she had quietly started keeping, Karen evidence. Each letter, each violation, each fine went neatly into that file. She didn't shred them, she didn't throw them away. She collected them like exhibits, each one a brick in a case she was slowly, methodically building. Karen, meanwhile, escalated her campaign. Anonymous complaint letters landed in neighbors' mailboxes, accusing Julia of thinking she was above the law. Emails circulated, warning that Julia's supposed defiance threatened property values. At the pool, whispers spread like wildfire, seeded by Karen's loyal circle. But Julia didn't flinch. She attended her usual morning jogs, greeted neighbors warmly, and kept her life exactly as it was. Her calmness frustrated Karen more than anything else. She wanted a reaction. She wanted a fight she could point to as proof of Julia's instability. But Julia gave her nothing. Behind closed doors, however, Julia prepared. She researched the HOA's bylaws, cross-referencing them with state statutes. She marked inconsistencies, highlighted unlawful clauses, and drafted quiet notes. She knew Karen was breaking rules of her own, rules that could dismantle her entire presidency if brought to light. The breaking point came a week later, when Karen showed up at a board member's barbecue armed with a clipboard full of signatures. She claimed to have the support of a majority of homeowners to initiate formal legal action against Julia. But when Julia heard about it, she didn't panic. She simply nodded, as if everything was going exactly as she expected. That night, Julia pulled out the Karen evidence folder. It was thick now, bulging with papers, notices, and screenshots. She laid them across the dining table like puzzle pieces, each one fitting neatly into a larger picture. Karen thought she was preparing for war. What she didn't realize was that Julia had already built her arsenal. The HOA president believed she had cornered Julia with escalating fines and threats. But in reality, Karen had walked straight into a legal trap, one Julia was now ready to spring. The battle lines were drawn. The neighborhood would soon be caught in the middle of a showdown between Karen's petty tyranny and Julia's unshakable authority. And when the clash came, it would not be quiet. It would shake the very foundation of Maplewood Estates. The simmering feud between Julia and Karen had become the unspoken center of life in Maplewood Estates. Neighbors who once chatted about lawn care and holiday lights now whispered about fines, police calls, and HOA politics. Each day, the division grew deeper. Karen's loyalists clung to her narrative. Julia was a troublemaker who believed herself untouchable because of her title. They repeated Karen's talking points at block gatherings, parroting her claims about community standards and protecting property values. But others had begun to doubt. They had seen the police officer's reaction, heard the absence of legal weight in Karen's arguments, and noticed Julia's composure in the face of escalating hostility. Some neighbors quietly admired Julia's calm defiance. Others, tired of Karen's overreach, began to question whether the HOA had gone too far. The real shift came when Karen, in her quest for dominance, made a crucial mistake. She mailed a community-wide newsletter accusing Julia of abusing her, a position as a judge to intimidate the HOA. The letter, full of bold claims and exaggerated accusations, was meant to rally support. Instead, it backfired. Residents read the newsletter and shook their heads. Some knew Julia personally and had seen no evidence of intimidation. Others recognized the dangerous line Karen had crossed by attacking someone's profession in writing. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs into conversations, conversations into quiet alliances forming against Karen. Meanwhile, Julia continued her careful preparation. She didn't respond publicly to Karen's accusations. She didn't call meetings or circulate letters. Instead, she focused on gathering evidence, documenting each violation of HOA bylaws, each misuse of funds, each procedural error Karen made in her haste to punish. Her folder had grown into a binder now, neatly labeled and meticulously organized. It was more than just a defense. It was a weapon. A case strong enough to not only overturn the fines, but to challenge Karen's leadership entirely. Neighbors started approaching Julia privately. Some knocked on her door under the guise of borrowing tools or sugar. But once, inside, they leaned closer and whispered, "We're tired of her too." Others slipped notes into her mailbox, thanking her for standing firm. The quiet majority had begun to shift. Karen, however, couldn't see it. She mistook silence for obedience, interpreting the absence of open rebellion as proof of her continued dominance. She strutted through the neighborhood with her binder of rules, her Lexus gleaming in the driveway, convinced that her reign remained unshaken. Her confidence only grew when she announced that the HOA board would be holding a special disciplinary hearing regarding Julia's fines. Karen envisioned it as her ultimate victory, a staged trial where Julia would finally be humiliated, forced to submit, and possibly even threatened with foreclosure. But Julia saw it differently. She recognized the hearing for what it truly was. An opportunity, a public forum, an official record, a stage on which Karen's abuses could finally be exposed. The day of the hearing arrived, and the community center buzzed with unusual energy. Neighbors who hadn't attended an HOA meeting in years showed up, curious to see the showdown. Folding chairs filled quickly, the air thick with anticipation. Karen presided at the front table, her binder stacked high, her voice dripping with authority. She welcomed the crowd with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, announcing that today would prove the HOA's strength and integrity. Julia walked in moments later, not with a lawyer, not with security, but alone. She carried her binder tucked neatly under her arm, her presence calm, unshaken. The whispers grew louder as people realized she wasn't there to defend herself. She was there to confront Karen head dash on Dot. Karen launched into her case with dramatic flair, presenting fines, notices, and accusations. She spoke of Julia's hostility, her refusal to cooperate, her supposed disruption of community peace. Every word was crafted to paint Julia as a villain. But when Julia's turn came, she didn't raise her voice. She simply laid her binder on the table, flipped it open, and began to read. She cited the HOA's bylaws. She highlighted violations of procedure. She exposed Karen's misuse of authority, her unlawful doubling of fines, her personal targeting of residents. She presented evidence, not opinions, facts, not dramatics. The room shifted. Neighbors leaned in, listening. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. The facade of Karen's authority began to crack under the weight of Julia's meticulous preparation. Karen's smile faltered. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. The hearing that was meant to cement her power was slipping from her grasp. And as Julia closed her binder, the words hung heavy in the air. This isn't about me. This is about the integrity of this association. The crowd erupted, not with applause, not with cheers, but with something more powerful, murmurs of agreement. Karen had wanted a stage. She got one. But she hadn't realized she was standing on a trapdoor. The disciplinary hearing had been meant to crown Karen's authority, but instead it left hairline fractures spreading across her carefully constructed empire. What she imagined as a display of power turned into a revelation of weakness. Neighbors shuffled out of the community center in silence, but their faces told the story. Furrowed brows, hushed whispers, sidelong glances aimed at Karen. She had always thrived on unquestioned loyalty, but loyalty began to look brittle under the weight of Julia's facts. That night, Karen paced her kitchen, the HOA binder sprawled across her counter. Her husband muttered that maybe she should let it go, but Karen snapped back, her eyes wild with obsession. To her, this wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about her crown, the invisible title she wore as ruler of Maplewood Estates. And Julia had just placed a crack right through it. But Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat. She doubled down. The very next morning, she sent out another newsletter, this time accusing Julia of staging a hostile takeover of the HOA. She framed herself as the victim, the lone protector of community order under siege by a powerful judge. It was meant to rally support. Instead, it split the neighborhood further. Some residents, weary of the drama, quietly considered moving. Others, emboldened by Julia's calm courage, began speaking more openly. A petition circulated calling for a review of Karen's leadership. At first, it gathered signatures slowly, discreetly. Then momentum grew. Within a week, nearly half the homeowners had signed. Karen sensed the tide turning against her, but rather than softening, she grew harsher. She weaponized HOA rules against other residents, issuing fines for minor infractions. A trash bin left visible, a lawn gnome slightly askew, a car parked inches too far from the curb. She thought fear would reassert control. Instead, it bred resentment. Julia, meanwhile, never lost her steady rhythm. She didn't gloat. She didn't campaign. She let Karen burn her own credibility while quietly strengthening her case. Her binder expanded into two. Each document was catalogued, each procedural failure highlighted. She wasn't just ready for an HOA meeting. She was ready for court. And court, as fate would have it, wasn't far away. Karen, in her desperation, filed a civil suit against Julia for unpaid fines. It was the move Julia had been waiting for. At last, Karen had dragged the battle from neighborhood theatrics into the arena where Julia was most comfortable. The law. Word spread like wildfire. A court date was set, and the neighborhood buzzed. With anticipation, some whispered that Julia would crush Karen effortlessly. Others clung to the hope that Karen's relentless stubbornness would finally pay off. On the morning of the hearing, Maplewood Estates felt like a ghost town. Many residents made the drive downtown, eager to witness the clash for themselves. Neighbors who had never stepped foot inside a courthouse now lined the benches, waiting to see which woman would emerge victorious. Karen entered the courtroom first, her binder clutched like a sword. She wore her best suit, her chin high, trying to project confidence, but the flicker of unease in her eyes betrayed her. She wasn't in Maplewood anymore. She wasn't in control. Moments later, Julia walked in, calm, composed, dressed not in her judge's robe, but in simple elegance that radiated quiet authority. She didn't need to play a role. She was the role. The gavel sounded. The case began. Karen launched her argument with fiery passion, detailing Julia's supposed violations, the unpaid fines, the disruption of community order. She gestured dramatically, her voice echoing through the courtroom. To the untrained ear, it almost sounded convincing. But Julia didn't flinch. When her turn came, she didn't waste time on theatrics. She laid out her evidence, methodically and meticulously. She demonstrated how Karen's actions violated the HOA's own bylaws, how fines were unlawfully escalated, how personal bias tainted every decision. She presented case law. She cited statutes. She dismantled Karen's binder piece by piece until it looked less like a weapon and more like a pile of paper. The judge presiding over the case, one of Julia's peers, listened carefully, his expression unreadable. But the weight of Julia's arguments, the precision of her preparation, left little room for doubt. Karen's empire was collapsing, not with a bang, but with the quiet inevitability of truth laid bare. By the time Julia rested her case, the outcome felt written in stone. The neighborhood that once feared Karen's wrath now waited for the final hammer to fall. And when it did, the sound would echo far beyond the courtroom walls. The courtroom was silent, every breath suspended in anticipation. Karen's binder sat closed on the table before her, its pages no longer a shield but a hollow reminder of the power she once thought unshakable. Julia's binder, by contrast, remained open. Neat tabs, highlighted statutes, organized evidence glowing under. The fluorescent lights like a beacon of order against chaos. The presiding judge leaned forward, his voice measured, his tone final. He ruled that the HOA's fines against Julia were unlawful. The notices, the escalations, even the disciplinary hearing, each one was struck down as a violation of both the HOA's bylaws and state law. Not only were the fines void, but Karen and the HOA board were now facing scrutiny for misuse of authority. The words rippled through the room like a seismic wave. Neighbors who had come to watch leaned back in their seats, exchanging stunned glances. Karen's face drained of color. Her reign, her crown, had been shattered in a single ruling. But the judge wasn't finished. He ordered the HOA to reimburse Julia for her legal expenses, an amount that would cripple the association's finances. He also recommended an external review of the board's conduct, a move that all but guaranteed Karen's days as president were numbered. The gavel struck. The case was over. Julia rose from her seat calmly, her binder tucked back under her arm. She didn't look at Karen. She didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any victory speech could have been. Neighbors followed Julia out of the courthouse, Some congratulating her quietly, others simply walking a little taller now that Karen's shadow had lifted from their lives. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates felt the possibility of freedom. Karen, however, remained seated long after the room had emptied. Her hands trembled against the polished wood of the table. The binder she had clung to for so long now felt like a chain dragging her down. She had believed herself untouchable, but arrogance had blinded her, and now she was alone. Back in the neighborhood, change came quickly. The petition to remove Karen as HOA president exploded with signatures. Within weeks, an emergency election was held. Karen was voted out in a landslide so decisive that even her closest allies abandoned her. The new board moved swiftly to repair the damage, revising bylaws, restoring fairness, and erasing the stains of Karen's rule. Julia never sought a position on the board. She didn't want power over her neighbors. She only wanted peace. But her role in dismantling Karen's reign became legend within Maplewood Estates. People who once stayed silent found their voices again. The fear that had lingered in every front yard, every mailbox, every neighborhood meeting, it was gone. Karen, stripped of her title, became a recluse in her own home. She no longer paraded her Lexus down the street or hosted gatherings in her living room. The neighbors she once commanded now avoided her gaze. The empire she built on fear had crumbled to dust. And Julia? She went back to her roses, back to mourning. Jogs, friendly waves, and the quiet life she had always valued. The storm had passed, leaving behind a neighborhood stronger, freer, and wiser than before. Yet, the story of Maplewood Estates didn't end there. It lived on, retold at barbecues, whispered on porches, passed down to new homeowners. The tale of the HOA president who thought she was queen, and the judge who reminded everyone what true authority really was. It wasn't a story of revenge. It wasn't even a story of victory. It was a story of balance, of what happens when arrogance collides with justice, and when a crown built on fear is shattered by the quiet strength of truth. And though Julia never sought to be a hero, in the eyes of her neighbors, she became something greater, the woman who gave them back their voice.